All right, let's get into it. Today, we're talking about one of modern Spain's most defining and honestly, most catastrophic military events. This is the story of a single battle fought in the summer of 1921 that would shake an entire kingdom to its core and totally change the course of its history. We're going to start with a number, 13,192. Now, this isn't just some abstract statistic on a slide. That's the official death toll for the Spanish army from one single disastrous campaign, a number that would literally haunt an entire generation.
And that really brings us to the main question here, right? How on earth did this happen? How could a modern, established European army get so completely and utterly shattered by a coalition of local tribesmen? To figure that out, we have to head to Morocco.
You see, in Spain, they don't just call this a battle. It's known as el desastre de Anual, the disaster of annual. And that's because this wasn't just some military loss on a faraway colonial front. No, this was a full-blown national trauma that set off a political firestorm and exposed just how rotten things were within the Spanish state.
So, the setting for all of this is the Rif War. It was a pretty brutal conflict where Spain was trying to lock down its control over its protectorate in northern Morocco. Their opponents, well, they were Berber tribes from the Rif Mountains, led by a truly brilliant tactician, a guy named el-Krim, who, funnily enough, used to work for the Spanish government.
So, how did this all start to unravel? Well, to get that, we need to rewind a bit, back to early 1921. The Spanish army was pushing deep into the heart of the Rif, feeling aggressive, feeling confident. The problem was, their entire strategy was dangerously flawed from the get-go. And here's the man in charge, General Manuel Fernandez Silvestre. He had a reputation for being impetuous, a bit reckless, and, this is key, a personal favorite of Spain's King Alfonso XIII. The king himself was allegedly egging him on, encouraging this aggressive push right into hostile territory. So what you have here is basically a ticking time bomb. The Spanish advance was stretched over 130 kilometers deep into enemy land. Their supply lines were at a breaking point, and the whole territory was being held by these tiny, isolated outposts, a lot of which didn't even have a reliable source of water. To top it all off, the army was mostly made up of poorly trained conscripts who really did not want to be there. It was just a complete recipe for disaster. And when we say outposts, this is what we're talking about. These things, called blockhouse, were just incredibly vulnerable. I mean, they were little more than some sandbags and wood scattered all over this hostile landscape. They were basically death traps just waiting to be sprung, totally unable to support each other. And in the weeks leading up to the main disaster, the warning signs were flashing bright red. A key outpost at Mount Abaran was overrun in June. Silvestre practically begged for more troops, but he was denied. Then, the really crucial garrison at Igorben gets besieged, and despite some desperate rescue attempts, it falls. The trap was definitely closing. And all of this brings us to July 22nd, 1921, at the main Spanish camp of Anual. Here you've got about 5,000 Spanish troops facing a really determined attack by 3,000 Riffian fighters. The whole Spanish position was just about to crumble. With ammunition running dangerously low and his forces about to be completely surrounded, General Silvestre finally gave the order to retreat. But what should have been an orderly, strategic withdrawal just fell apart. It became a panicked, chaotic flight for survival. The terrified conscripts broke ranks, and they were just cut down by the charging tribesmen. But in the middle of all that absolute chaos, there was this one moment of just incredible discipline and bravery. It was the cavalry regiment, the Cazadores de Alcántara. They repeatedly charged the enemy to cover the retreat of their fleeing comrades. They literally fought until they were almost completely wiped out, a truly heroic sacrifice in what was otherwise a shameful, catastrophic defeat. Here's the thing, though. The defeat at Anual, that was just a spark. It lit a fire that just consumed the entire Spanish front. What came next wasn't really a battle. It was a complete, cascading collapse of Spain's entire military presence in the Eastern Rif. Just take a look at this map. It shows you the breathtaking speed of the collapse. In just a few weeks, Spanish forces were pushed all the way back, almost to the city of Melilla. They lost every inch of territory they had painstakingly gained since 1909. Over 130 of those blockhouse and garrisons were overrun, one after another. So the Riffians didn't just win a victory, they won an entire arsenal.
As their leader Abd el-Krim later boasted, Spain had effectively armed his rebellion. They left behind thousands of rifles, hundreds of machine guns, and tons of artillery pieces. The retreat ended in this final, just horrifying chapter at a place called Monte Arroy. There, about 3,000 Spanish soldiers who had been promised they'd be safe if they surrendered were massacred after they laid down their weapons. It was a brutal end to a catastrophic campaign. And General Silvestre? He was never seen again. So naturally, the shockwaves from Morocco slammed into Madrid, and they sparked an intense political crisis. The public was furious, and they wanted answers. Who was responsible for a disaster this big? The blame game started, and believe me, it went all the way to the top. A lot of that public anger started to focus on King Alfonso XIII. So the story goes that when he was told how much ransom Abd el-Krim was demanding for the captured Spanish prisoners, the king, who was on vacation, supposedly remarked, "Chicken meat is cheap." Now, whether he actually said it or not almost doesn't matter. The story spread like wildfire, and it cemented this image of him as a totally callous and out-of-touch monarch. Of course, there was an official investigation called the Expediente Picasso, and its report was absolutely damning. It detailed gross incompetence and negligence at every single level of the military command. But, and this is a huge but, it conveniently avoided placing any blame on the politicians or on the king, and that just led to massive accusations of a cover-up. And this right here is why annual matters so much. The total failure to hold anyone truly accountable for the disaster just poisoned Spanish politics. It led directly to a military coup in 1923. The dictatorship that followed so discredited the monarchy that by 1931, the king was forced out, which paved the way for the Second Spanish Republic. So in the end, the disaster of Annual was so much more than a battle. It was this brutal moment of reckoning for Spain, born from overconfidence, terrible leadership, and political negligence. And it really forces us to ask, what happens when a country refuses to learn from its most painful mistakes?